Good afternoon, dear distinguished guests, dear participants. My name is Dr. Süha Çubukçuoğlu. I'm an advisory board member at Turkish Energy Strategies and Politics Research Center in Istanbul. Just to give a brief background of myself, I just completed my doctoral degree in international affairs at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C., US, and returned to Turkey. I work as a researcher, as a consultant, and I'm currently in transition to move to Abu Dhabi, to United Arab Emirates, to work as a senior fellow in the Department of Strategic Studies at Trans Research and Advisory. I would like to thank the organizing committee, especially Dr. Hüseyin Gökçekuş, for inviting me to present in this session. And I would like to wish you all participants a great day, and apologies for not being available to present live in this session due to my other commitments, conflicting time and other commitments in Istanbul. But thank you for giving me the opportunity to present in this session. My presentation is titled Turkey's Natural Gas Policy, Economics, Security and Diplomacy. By looking at political, economic and security factors in Turkish government's decision to diversify its energy resources and partnerships, what I will do is I will aim to uncover causal factors behind Ankara's multi-vector diplomacy and quest for energy security. And my slide presentation has 6 slides in total, so it will take me probably 15 to 20 minutes to go through the deck. And thank you for your attention in advance. Moving on to the next slide. The 2 key questions that I try to address in my paper and hence in this presentation are: what factors have shaped Turkey's quest for energy security recently? Why has access to natural gas heightened in importance? We see this especially in recent years, since 2016, since the failed coup attempt, that Turkey has harnessed a more national policy around securing its energy sources and being more active both at seas and in abroad in third countries to access secure energy resources. Now, this has implicitly ties with geopolitics, of course. And when we do a geopolitical analysis, we look at three key pillars. And these are the fundamentals, the imperatives, and constraints of geopolitics. First, let's start with what geopolitics is. Geopolitics is the interplay between power, geographic space, and strategic decision-making on one hand, with various state actors pursuing individual or collective interests on the other hand. And that brings us to the first pillar of our analytical tool set, which is geopolitical fundamentals. And so let's look at what these are. These are the geography, demography, resources, and history. So what we mean by geography is physical terrain, location and size of a country, and the climate surrounding it. Turkey is located at a key location at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa. It is situated at the intersection of trade routes, waterways, and transit energy corridors that connect Africa with Eurasia. The next pillar is history. So that touches upon the interplay of different cultures, different societies. And when we look at Turkey's region, we see deep-rooted rivalries, failed states such as Syria, autocracies like in Iran, and failed and civil wars like again in Syria, in Iraq, and elsewhere like in Libya, where political instability and prolonged conflicts are the norm. Turkey is a NATO member, it's an OECD member, and hence it's got a special place in the Middle Eastern geographic, geoeconomic and geostrategic landscape. The third pillar is demography, which touches on the population, ethnicity, religion, and culture, as well as the values around it. So with 85 million population and is expected to hit 90 million by 2045, of which 50% are under age of 25, Turkey has a huge potential. It's in the league of G20, and has a great productive capacity, a relatively diversified industrial base, and the combination of both productive and human capital, capital factors and human factors combined, give Turkey a big potential to grow economically. Gas is a critical commodity for power generation, industry production, and household consumption. So that is the fourth and the final part of it, which is actually the topic of this presentation. It touches upon energy, minerals, and agriculture, but in specific, I will focus on natural gas as the most critical commodity. And I argue that without which Turkey cannot secure an economic future in the near term. So moving on to my next slide. Let's look at geopolitical imperatives. So we looked at geopolitical fundamentals. Let's look at some of the geopolitical imperatives. What are these fundamentals telling us? What are some of Turkey's strategic goals? There are broadly three strategic goals that countries pursue. One is domestic political and security consolidation. 2, protection from neighbors and external powers. 3, expansion of regional and global influence, and that can be in political, economic, or defense ties, to counter challengers in the region or beyond. Now, not all states achieve all these imperatives. These are ranked in order of priority, but for instance, Ukraine, let's take as an example, is not even at 1 because it's going through a tumultuous period where there is no domestic political and security consolidation there yet, with the east and west of the country split in terms of territorial split, but also migration and the ongoing war. Russia, for instance, is pursuing 2. It's trying to sort of build this defensive belt in its outer perimeter to protect itself from neighbors or external powers. The US, EU, and China are doing 3, so they are even at a more advanced stage where they try to expand their regional or global influence to counter their potential or existing challengers. Now, Turkey is at 1, and it's pursuing 2. So we have consolidated our political and domestic security, me as being a Turkish citizen and being in Istanbul, I speak as we. So on behalf of Turkey, our long-term goal is to achieve 3. So we're pursuing 2, which is the protection from external powers and neighbors. But in the long term, Turkish government is pursuing goal number 3, which is expansion of regional and global influence to counter challengers from abroad. Having said that, if we look at, giving these goals, let's look at some of the strategic limits, the constraints that Turkey is facing. So we looked at Turkey's main goals that transcend the specific government in power. So that's why I haven't used any particular political party name or a leader's name, because I believe that these transcend Turkish governments, and these are generally state goals. And also looking at main constraints that transcend specific governments in power. Again, we see 4 pillars. So geographic, demographic, external, and economic. So Turkey has, as we stated, has an important geographic location. It's got strategic depth, both in terms of east-west axis mainly, but also north-south axis. And at the same time, it has rival neighbors, and they vie for regional leadership. And these regional powers include, for instance, Greece, for instance, Iran, Russia is as well, and the US, which are global players, but they also have regional ambitions around Turkey. If we look at economic factors, for instance, resource endowment, accessibility of resources, and equitable distribution of resources, that's where energy geopolitics comes in. Because in terms of hydrocarbons, for instance, Turkey is a relatively resource-poor country, but it's got other means of energy sources, such as wind and solar and geothermal and possibly nuclear. In terms of demographic limits, Turkey has a young population, is growing, but it's got a declining rate of population growth. And there is also this problem of external migration and brain drain, and education, in terms of educating young people to increase their productivity and having them contribute more to economic activities is a key challenge facing Turkey. And external factors, of course, there are wars in Ukraine, Syria, and Libya, as well as in Iraq and other countries where Turkey is somehow involved. So all these put together present challenges to Turkey's geopolitical influence and economic growth. Moving on to my next slide. Let's look at Turkey's energy fundamentals, what state we are in right now. So energy security for Turkey means access to affordable, sustainable, and reliable resources to maintain its annual economic growth targets. Let's look at what these targets are. So economic roadmap for 2025 that the government has announced are to achieve 5% plus, let's say, GDP growth rate per annum, almost 10% inflation rate, and over $12,000 per capita income. Now that's an ambitious target. And considering what the roadmap to Turkey should adopt to reach these targets, we need to put down certain facts on the table. So energy accounts for 25% of Turkey's imports, and Turkey imports readily 75% of its energy demand. So it's still relatively an energy poor country. And energy imports account for almost 50% of liability in the current account deficit. And it's a chronic problem that comes up every now and again that Turkey has to turn around via borrowing in foreign markets. So let's look at Turkey's energy mix. If energy is such an important pillar for Turkish economy, what are some of the factors that bring it to the fore? Why is it so important? And what are those pillars? So if we look at Turkey's energy mix, natural gas has 30% share. Others are renewables, coal, and oil. Out of almost $50 billion paid for energy imports last year in 2021, about $30 billion went towards nearly 60 billion cubic meters of imported gas. And it's sourced from a variety of countries in the region and beyond. So pipeline inputs account for 75%. LNG, liquefied natural gas, accounts for 25% of it. Now, pipeline gas from Azerbaijan, Iran, and Russia, that still accounts for the greatest portion of the imported volume. Although, if you look at the trend, it's been declining over the past, almost a decade. So it reached its peak at 87% in 2013, and it's down to 75% since last year. As mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, gas is a critical commodity for power generation, industry production, and household consumption. It's actually most of import gas is used for electric power generation and household consumption. So that accounts for the major bulk of consumption. If Turkey can, for instance, conserve some of gas consumption at home by efficiency, by educating people, it can direct more of the imported volume to industry production, and that would help Turkey to achieve economic growth perhaps faster. Now, energy security is heightened in importance in Turkey, and Turkey has ratified COP21 Paris Climate Treaty, as you all know, which was signed in 2015. And the government pledged to achieve carbon neutrality by 2053. But there's a challenge, and that is that Turkey's carbon footprint will peak only in 2038. So we're in 2022. It will take at least another 15, 16 years for Turkey to reach that peak stage in carbon footprint, and only then start to decline to meet the stated target of carbon neutrality by 2053. That's an ambitious target as well, and it's got regulatory, economic, and political challenges facing it, because that only leaves 15 years to reach that carbon neutrality stage, which is going to be a difficult target to achieve, albeit possible. International Energy Agency has estimated that hydrocarbons will account for 60% of primary energy demand, even by 2050. So we have a long road ahead. I mean, renewables are intermittent. So they cannot account for all of the lost capacity in hydrocarbons or power generation through hydrocarbons. So oil and gas is still there to stay for the foreseeable future. And Turkey is no exception to this. It still depends on natural gas consumption for the foreseeable future to sustain its economy. Energy security is heightened in importance, as I mentioned, due to shifting geopolitical landscape, global economic downturn, and a quest for leadership in an increasingly tumultuous region. A war in Ukraine has also heightened Turkey's geopolitical significance and increased its maneuverability and transactional deal making between multiple power centers. So we live in a bipolar world, so between US and China, but it's increasingly more multi-layered and multi-centered. So Turkey, as a regional middle power, is playing that game very well by not putting all of its eggs into the same basket as it did before, prior to 2016, but it's sort of expanded these partnerships and built trade ties with many power centers, increasingly more with Eurasian countries, to sort of balance out the risk of both in economic terms and security terms. If we look at what Turkey's energy strategy looks like, there's an interesting analogy that I would like to make, and that is between energy and monetary policy. So if you look at energy, as I mentioned earlier, Turkey's goal is to have access to affordable, sustainable, and reliable energy. But that seems, as it stands currently, as mentioned earlier, because renewables are intermittent and they are not a pure play game. So they have to be backed up by base fuels such as oil and gas and coal. So necessarily, Turkey cannot adopt all three goals at the same time. This brings into mind what economists call the impossible trilemma. Just to recap, so as you know, in economics, there is this famous impossible trilemma where a country cannot have all three of free capital mobility, sovereign monetary policy, and exchange rate management. You can only have two at a time. So if you want free capital mobility, you can have either exchange rate management or sovereign monetary policy, not all three at the same time. So let's look at Turkey's case. As mentioned earlier, in Turkish government necessarily places short to mid-term energy security and affordability instead of long-term emissions reduction, let's say, and climate mitigation as a top priority. So sustainability has lower priority in my findings in my research than affordability and reliability. So Turkey, because of the ongoing geopolitical turmoil around the region, wants access to affordable and reliable energy to sustain its economic growth as a priority. Well, to have access to renewables is a goal, but it's a long-term goal. It's not something that has very high priority compared to the rest. And same goes with monetary policy. The government has opted for free capital mobility and sovereign monetary policy instead of exchange rate management, or to peg exchange rate to a certain currency or a basket of currencies is not something that it has opted to do. There is a correlation. I just wanted to borrow that idea from economics and apply it to energy and show you that there is possibly a trilemma in here that the country cannot achieve all at the same time. So on the net assessment, the main challenge is excessive dependence on pipeline gas with unfavorable contract terms. So as it stands, Turkey imports 75% of its natural gas through pipelines, and these are take or pay type pipeline contracts with like destination clauses, minimum purchase commitments, and oil indexed high prices that continue to create geopolitical risks for Turkey. Perhaps pipeline gas is more reliable than LNG. So looking at the trilemma above, so reliability is an important factor in Turkey's decision to stick with pipelines, but it's inflexible and is prone to geopolitical bargaining, more so than with LNG. What this tells us is that if, going back to the trilemma, if Turkey wants to have affordable supplies, for instance, cheaper natural gas input, it cannot have both a sustainable and reliable energy policy, because in order to have sustainable energy policy, like renewables in the game, it's going to have to necessarily increase the costs. It's going to be very expensive. So with that background, Turkey does not prefer another political fallout with Russia, at least not in the near term. That's why it's playing the sort of balance of power game between different centers around the globe. And it necessarily plays this diplomacy to reduce its economic and security vulnerability. The upside is that Turkey is no longer as politically vulnerable to Russia's use of gas as a weapon because of developing ties in tourism, trade, and not just in gas trade, energy trade, but in terms of other goods. Turkey and Russia have closer ties. That means Moscow cannot afford to single out Turkey and abandon it through manipulative use of energy as a weapon. Coming to my conclusion now, as the time is also rounding up, in terms of policy recommendations for Turkey's gas strategy, Turkey, I think, should diversify sources of natural gas inflows to support energy transition. That's the right thing to do, and it should do so more. It should use a buyer's advantage in an oversupplied gas market to renegotiated pipeline contracts with the neighboring countries, and continue to increase the scale and volume of LNG imports to replace inflexible pipeline input, and develop offshore gas in the Black Sea region. So that would also include Mediterranean, in my view, as a priority, since Cyprus is in the Mediterranean and Turkey has important rights around Cyprus Island in terms of maritime areas like continental shelves. Turkey should give more priority for developing these fields, and combined with reduced wasteful energy consumption, which surprisingly actually hits all the way 35% in electricity generation, and by educating people to conserve energy, it can have more secure energy supplies, and with a better planned consumption scheme, it will be more secure than in the pre-2022 period. And last but not least, I would like to touch upon nuclear power and Akkuyu plant, for instance, that's being built and will come into production soon, and possible purchase of small modular reactors. We heard and read in the news that Turkey is in negotiations with the US to purchase perhaps a set of SMRs to come into service. Then Turkey's nuclear power can avail more gas for exports. So that means in the future, Turkey will not necessarily use gas only for domestic consumption, well, it can avail it for exports as well, if it can cover more of its domestic demand through alternative means of power generation. With that, I would like to conclude my presentation, and thank you all for listening to me. And if you'd like to reach me at any point, you can find my email address at the bottom of this slide. Wishing you a great rest of the day. Thank you.